We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. The Western capitalist media, also known as the mainstream media, is deliberately misleading people about the U.S.-Israeli aggression against the people of Gaza, the people of the West Bank, the people of Lebanon, and about the danger of a wider regional war in the Middle East, including Iran. Welcome to this week's episode of the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with journalist and author Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He's the chief editor of LeftWord books, and he is a prolific author, most recently publishing a new book with Noam Chomsky called On Cuba, Reflections of 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle. Vijay Prashad, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. Thanks. Nice to be with you.
Great to have you. Vijay, we have a lot to cover. We're going to talk about the Middle East war. We're going to talk about, as I mentioned in the intro, the lying media, the capitalist media, the so-called mainstream media. I want to talk about the danger of a regional war. You're following the danger very closely. You've been to the Middle East frequently. You know what's going on. But then as we go on, I also want to talk to you about the Ukraine war, about the U.S. military buildup against China. There's a lot to talk about here, but let's get started with the capitalist media, the so-called mainstream media. The New York Times, famous for the cliche, the slogan, all the news that's fit to print. Well, I was looking at headlines in the New York Times. They were really amazing, Vijay. One stated, it was changed shortly thereafter, but it starts with these words. Israel carries out major bombing of Hezbollah stronghold in Lebanon. Hezbollah stronghold. There's another way they could have worded that, which is Israel bombs a major, densely packed urban neighborhood in the southern part of Beirut, and hundreds of civilians were killed. But when you have the headline saying it's a major Hezbollah stronghold, the reader, maybe those who don't read this story, and that perhaps is most people who see a headline, they come to the conclusion that Israel has just hit and killed Hezbollah fighters. Anyway, this is so important because the narrative shapes people's consciousness. If it was a state-owned media, let's say we were reading a story from the old Soviet Union, people would say, oh, Pravda, well, that's what the Soviet government wants us to think because it's a state-owned media. The New York Times isn't state-owned, it's private. It's the free press. And thus you get the idea, the wrong idea, that it's somehow independent of the U.S. government. Anyway, let's get started.
Yeah, I mean, it's a travesty that has been there for now decades. This phraseology that, defines how the media such as the New York Times, but also BBC, the German media, Bild, and others covers the Middle East. Beirut has for a very long time been euphemistically called a Hezbollah stronghold, particularly the south of Beirut. This, use of the term Hezbollah stronghold almost gives license to either Israel or, in some earlier instances, the United States to directly bomb this part of Beirut. I'm going to come back to what this part of Beirut is, but I want to bring into the conversation, Brian, something that the German foreign minister, Anneli Baerbock, said in the Bundestag, in German parliament. She was talking about Gaza, but this is the same point. She said that and this is in the German parliament, mind you, she said that if Hamas takes civilians and uses them as shields, then the places where Hamas is using civilian shields is now a military target. In other words, there is no immunity for civilians. Civilians lose their immunity if they're in the proximity of Hamas. This is, by the way, not in accordance with international law. There is no international law that permits combatants to fire on civilian areas if they believe there are other combatants there. That is actually against international law. In the German parliament, the German foreign minister has basically provided the Israelis a justification to go out there and bomb Gaza even more. And by the way, the safe areas of Gaza, Brian, are now with a density of population of 35,000 people per square kilometer. Just for comparison, in the United States, the density of population is 35 per square kilometer. Obviously, this is uneven. New York City is more congested than, say, the plains of Texas or Oklahoma. But even New York City is nowhere near a density of population 35,000 people a square kilometer. It's way under the thousands, way under. So when Annalie Baerbock and people like that and the New York Times talk about, let's say, Hamas, whatever strategic area or a Hezbollah stronghold, they are basically violating international law by permitting the Israeli government to bomb areas where the density of population is extremely high, and therefore the civilian casualties will be very high. If you look carefully at the kind of explosives used, whether it's the 2,000-pound bomb or the 500-pound bomb, there is no way, despite claims about precision bombing, and it's true, bombs today are more precise than they were 100 years ago. But there is no way to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a building in Beirut and not kill immediately thousands of people. There is no way. The bombing against Syed Hassan Nasrallah, they used 80 bombs of different weights, but a number of them being 2,000-pound bombs. We don't even yet know how many civilians died there, because the crater that was created in a smaller scale resembles the bomb dropped by the US government in a province bordering Pakistan and Afghanistan called the mother of all bombs. So this usage of the term, Hezbollah stronghold, Hamas command and control center, Taliban stronghold, this has been with us for a long time. It is itself a violation of international law. The New York Times should not be using phrases like that if it has any decency. I mean, what they should actually write is the Israelis bomb Beirut. That is actually what they should be saying, not a Hezbollah stronghold. Beirut is not a Hezbollah stronghold. Hezbollah is a major political party in Lebanon with members of parliament in the Lebanese parliament. To call them just a combatant organization is ridiculous. People that died were in the political wing of Hezbollah. They don't have any relationship to the armed section of Hezbollah. So this idea of Hezbollah stronghold, or indeed Hamas stronghold, and so on, is very dangerous, and it itself, in my opinion, provides license to the Israelis. But there's nothing worse than having the foreign minister of a European country make the same kind of argument in a parliament. That was actually quite shocking to me. I've been inured to watching the press make all kinds of ridiculous statements, but having a foreign minister of a government in Europe say that in a parliament was shocking. And I'm not so easily shocked any longer.
Yeah, and again, just for people watching this show or listening to the show, think about it. If a foreign country came and dropped big bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, 1,800-pound bombs, that's what the Israelis are dropping on these neighborhoods. That's what they, as you wrote and talked about, the Israelis dropped 80 bombs, including 2,000-pound bombs, on one block where 6 buildings were flattened in order to kill Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. Just think if somebody did that, a foreign country did that, say, where I am in Midtown Manhattan, and then somebody would say, so-and-so, such and such country bombed a Democratic Party stronghold uh, in the United States because New York is dominated by the Democrats. Or let's say somebody bombed Alabama and Mississippi or Florida and said a Republican Party stronghold was bombed. Like, nobody would accept that as like journalism. That's just straight out apologist propaganda for the bombers. And again, the Geneva Convention and other international law, Vijay, is quite clear on it. I mean, you can't get clearer. It says to belligerents in armed conflict that if there are civilians who could be killed as you're attacking enemy combatants, in other words, if they are close enough to the enemy combatants that you want to kill, you can't strike. I mean, that's the Geneva Convention. And all of the countries that are signers to the Geneva Convention, again, it's routinely violated. But it's important to point out that the U.S. government knows about the Geneva Convention. The New York Times knows about it. I'm sure if Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran did the same thing and used the same language, they would say, no, that's a war crime. They certainly, freely use the terminology of war crimes or war criminals, say, against Milosevic in Yugoslavia when, after the U.S. dropped 28,000 bombs and missiles on Yugoslavia in 1999, and then took the head of state and brought him to The Hague and charged him with war crimes. So they freely talk about war crimes. It's not like they're unaware of the language of war crimes. It's just that it doesn't apply to the United States. It doesn't apply to NATO allies, and it doesn't apply to Israel. One other thing really struck me, and you highlighted this in your recent Tricontinental Research dossier, the recent one, and I want to encourage people to subscribe. But you go into this former U.S. aviator Commander Graham Scarborough, or something like that. He talks about, the language here is amazing, Vijay, because he talks about Israel. Here, I'm going to quote from it for you. He says, Israel seems to have a higher threshold for collateral damage, meaning they may strike even when chances are higher for civilian casualties. The Israelis have a higher threshold for civilian casualties. So what does that mean? It means like Israel is deliberately bombing civilians. And the soft, passive language, they have a higher threshold than, quote, we do, which again is not true, because if the we is the United States government, one only need look at Fallujah in Iraq or Vietnam to see about the threshold for civilian casualties. But again, it's the language which is seemingly accepted by the capitalist mainstream media because it helps them.
I mean, from my perspective, Brian, this is a very important article written by a U.S. official, a military official in a U.S. military website. It's a very important article, and let's look at some of the recent events that underline that. Look, it's true, that the United States bombed ferociously the Iraqis, illegal war of 2003. It was called shock and awe. I mean, they intentionally bombed ferociously. The bombing of Libya was ferocious, but nothing compares qualitatively to what we are seeing now. When the Nobel Peace Prize was recently given to the survivors of the atomic bomb attack, one of the survivors, who himself was irradiated at the age of 3, Toshiyuki Mimaki, he said that, look, I thought that the people in Gaza would get the prize this year. That's what he said. And he said, this attack on Gaza reminds me of Japan. In fact, there are some important differences which will come to this issue of so-called collateral damage. One is that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Most people around the world had no idea what the impact of that bomb would be. Just a small number of scientists, technicians, and people in the US government and military knew about it. But we didn't know it was going to happen. And we didn't know that a second bomb was going to be dropped on Nagasaki. But in this case, the bombing has been titrated. It's not one giant nuclear bomb. It's been titrated over the course of a year. So we've been watching the civilian casualties add up. We're watching the so-called collateral damage. That's different from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's an important difference. We know what's coming tomorrow. In fact, we are in the month of October. Already 3 schools, which are have become shelters in Gaza. 3 schools were struck in the course of just a few days. And I think this is important for people to understand, because this is in the Deir el Balan neighborhood of Gaza. The 3 schools that were struck were the Ahmad al Kurd school, hit on October the 5th, Al Aisha school, hit on October the 3rd, and then Rufaida Al Aslamia secondary school for girls, hit on October 10th. Few days later, there was the bombing of the tents right next to the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, where the young man, there was this terrible video of a young man on fire with his hand up. He had his hand attached to an IV drip. A young 19-year-old man, Shaban, who was a guitarist, did very well in his exams, and so on. This bombing of the Deir el Balan neighborhood in Gaza was very clearly an attack on civilians. There was no understanding that there's any Hamas there. In fact, when they bombed the girls' secondary school on October 10th, the Israelis made a public declaration saying, "We hate Hamas." The 28 names that were released, biographies of each of the names are available. I read them through. One was, by the way, a 6-year-old child. The other was an 86-year-old woman. I doubt that they have operational capacity inside Hamas. Very much doubt it. There was a policeman killed. The administrator of the school was killed. None of these people had any affiliation to Hamas in their biographies. In fact, in an earlier bombardment where 30 some civilians were killed, I again looked at each of the biographies of the people. I contacted local journalists, talked to people who are in the area, and several of the people who had been killed in that Israeli attack a couple of months ago were in fact publicly opposed to Hamas. They had a different political orientation. This didn't seem to matter to the media. I mean, you remember when the New York Times ran those biographies of people who had died in 9/11, very interesting biographies of the people. I would like to suggest that a newspaper such as the New York Times takes the time, makes an effort, one attack. Let's take the Rufaida al-Aslamia school attack of October 10th. I will supply the New York Times journalists the names of the people. I will even help them get in touch with people on the ground, great reporters that are there. Imad Zakut, for instance, a very good reporter on the ground. I'll get them in touch with people, with Abu Bakr Abed. Let Abu Bakr Abed go and show them who these people were. And wouldn't it be a challenge for the New York Times to print a page of its paper on the 28 people killed at this one school and their biographies, to dispel the myth that these people are all with Hamas? Because this idea that all Palestinians are Hamas, or all Lebanese, or at least Lebanese who are Shia, are Hezbollah, is a deeply worrying trend that is normalizing violence and allowing the civilian casualties to be set aside. I would like to just give them a challenge publicly, Brian, and say that if the New York Times is interested, please get in touch with me.
Very good. I hope they take you up, Vijay, on your offer. Again, let's talk about language and its importance. I want to just stay with the subject because, as Marx said, and I've quoted frequently on this show, Marx made the point that the ideas of any society are the ideas of its ruling class until such time when they no longer are the ideas of society, and then there's revolution. But in the meantime, or before that, prior to that, the ruling class dominates the narrative, or ruling class elites. And they have different factions and tendencies. It's not like a monolith. The ruling class is not a group of people who sit in a boardroom in Wall Street and make decisions. There are factions, there are tendencies, there are contradictions, but they all agree on some things. And in this case, in the case of the United States, and unlike, say, the Vietnam War, where there was a sharp division within the ruling class over whether the war should be continued or ended once they realized they couldn't defeat the Vietnamese, then there was like a debate in the U.S. media over whether the war should continue. Walter Cronkite told the American people after the Tet Offensive, there is no light at the end of this tunnel. And the media sort of became the mouthpiece of a fight within the ruling class about whether the war should continue. In the case of the Middle East, there's unity right now in the ruling class about Israel. So the language is the people who oppose Israeli aggression or Israeli occupation or Israeli apartheid, the people who take up arms against it, they are terrorists. Their neighbors who defend their country against Israeli aggression, they are terrorists. But if Israel kills 41,000 people in a densely packed area, the most densely packed area in the world, Gaza is only 5 miles wide, 25 miles long, that's not terrorism. There's been no usage of the term terrorist to define the Israeli war. Now, let's go back. Let's roll the video back. Let's go to South Africa. In the mid-1980s, or sort of towards the end of the 1980s, I think it was 1988, the U.S. House of Representatives had a vote of whether the terrorist designation of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress should be ended because the U.S. designated the ANC, as they designate the Palestinian resistance groups, as a terrorist organization. Why? Because the U.S. was then supporting South Africa until there became a division within the U.S. ruling class over whether that was a wise policy. That division was caused, as it was in Vietnam, by mass protest, the global movement of opposition. But eventually a section of the ruling class said, no, this policy of supporting apartheid is a bad idea. Let's move to a new policy. Let's free Nelson Mandela. And so Congress finally voted in 1988 to say Nelson Mandela is not a terrorist. But up until then, he was a terrorist. So to the people of South Africa, he was always a freedom fighter. He was an opponent of apartheid. He was a hero. But in America, he was a terrorist. Again, I think it's really important, this designation and the usage of the language terrorism to demonize those who are fighting against colonization. If the American Revolution the American War of Independence was taking place right now, King George, who also used colorful, demonizing language against George Washington, would definitely call him a terrorist. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about this.
You know, it's interesting. The paper cracked a little bit after the pager attack against the people of Lebanon conducted by Israeli intelligence. Remember, there were a bunch of pagers delivered into Lebanon. These pagers then exploded. There was a great deal of panic inside Lebanon before the bombings began, that radios would explode, or the devices that parents use to listen to their children in a different room, those might explode, and so on. When all of this was taking place, ex-CIA director and Defense Secretary Leon Panetta came out and said, well, it's no doubt that this is an act of terrorism. But it's very interesting what he said. And I think it bears, repeating his argument. Firstly, he did acknowledge that the Israelis conducted an act of terrorism. But then he said, what's dangerous is that now this form of terrorism is up and down the supply chain. In other words, other people might use this because it is, in fact, a low intensity form of creating panic in a society. If you get 20 pages, or in another country, let's say mobile phones, to start exploding in people's pockets, it just creates an overall sense of panic. And that, after all, is part of the goals of terrorism. Mr. Panetta made these comments, ex-CIA, ex-defense secretary, worrying more about the implications of having opened the Pandora's box on letting small electronic devices explode, very badly damage people, injure people, and so on. But he did say it's an act of terrorism. And it's interesting that sort of disappeared after maybe a day or so in the news cycle, because it's just apparently unconscionable to believe that Israel is acting in a terrorist manner. You may remember, Brian, some years ago, Noam Chomsky gave a very interesting interview where he said the United States is the greatest terrorist force on the planet Earth. That statement was not reported anywhere. It's a pretty interesting statement because Chomsky is a linguist. He's very careful with his language. He's not, somebody who likes to exaggerate with language. And he said very precisely, look, the United States spreads terror around the world. One of the forms of spreading terror is by providing weaponry to various forces that destabilize the world. This bombing that has been taking place in Gaza and in Lebanon is armed fully by the United States. And therefore, if this is sowing terror in Gaza, if a population that cannot defend itself against the dropping of a 2,000-pound bomb, has to just live with the experience of that, it's a form of terrorism. United States, therefore, is a participant in this act of terror because they are refusing to stop providing the weapons. Very interesting. The New York Times and Washington Post both covered this. You see, when the US makes a large weapons delivery, there has to be a discussion in the US Congress. I mean, there's arms control issues involved, there's foreign policy implications, and so on. So there are oversight committees in the US Congress that are supposed to look into these things. But in order to give the president or the executive some threshold, they have a barrier. If you provide less than so many arms, you don't have to make a declaration to Congress. You can just, with executive order, provide weapons. So what the Biden administration has been doing, or shall I say the Biden Harris administration, is during the course of this year, they've done a number of arms deliveries to Israel that come below the threshold. And since they are below the threshold, they are administrative deliveries of arms. They don't have any congressional oversight. There's no political discussion, and therefore there's been very little media debate and discussion. Even though, when you add it all up, it's tens of billions of dollars worth of lethal equipment that the United States has provided to Israel. And I earlier quoted from the German foreign minister. The United States provides about 80% of Israel's imported weaponry. The Germans provide almost 20% of the imported equipment and bombs and so on that the Israelis are using. Between Germany and the United States, you got it covered. There's a little bit from the United Kingdom and so on, but those are small numbers. Italy, 65% of the population, Brian, is against arms delivery to Israel. In Germany, the number is rising. It's about 33% or so against arms delivery to Israel. And we've seen this now move from a political kind of debate and concern, because people are going around the media and learning about these things in their own way, to an electoral issue. In Germany, for instance, the ruling traffic light coalition of the Free Democrats, the Greens, and the Social Democrats have been losing in all the provincial elections. And the gain has been not just the far right, but the new left. The Bundes Sarah Wagenknecht, for instance, made in its first electoral outing in Saxony and Thuringia, got above 15% of the vote. That is extraordinary. They've taken a firm position against both the war in Ukraine and in Palestine. And recently in Belgium, the Belgian Workers' Party, very strong position against the genocide of the Palestinians in many cities. In Antwerp, second largest city in Belgium, got over 20% of the vote. It's important to point out that the Belgian Workers' Party would have got more of the vote had the government, out of fear, not cancelled compulsory voting. When they cancelled compulsory voting, 40% of the population didn't come out to vote. And when there's no compulsory voting, it's often the working class and the youth that don't come out in as large numbers as the middle class. That's the natural constituency of the Workers' Party. They would have had a better showing than over 20%, which itself is double their gains in 2018. In France, the alliance of the left, in fact, has the biggest bloc in parliament. They are against the genocide taking place in Gaza. So even in Europe, you're seeing a real shift of public opinion, which I think is also being mirrored slower, but being mirrored in the United States.
And that's not unimportant. In contemporary world public and contemporary politics, world public opinion actually matters. It may not matter instantly. A lot of people get frustrated, even when we have mass demonstrations in the U.S. of 500,000, and then hundreds of thousands, and then 500,000 again, and daily demonstrations and encampments, and the bombing doesn't stop. Some people say, "Oh, look, it doesn't matter. These demonstrations don't work." Well, no, they don't work immediately. Nobody thought you have one demonstration and the imperialists are going to say, oh, we've rethought our position and now we're going to stop. No, that's not how it works. But public opinion and consciousness of the masses of people matters. It might not have mattered in 16th century Europe, but it does matter now. It does matter in contemporary world politics. I want to stay with this issue of the Israeli arms, of the American arms shipments to Israel, because they're so important. And again, I'm going back to your dossier, and people, I want to keep encouraging people, subscribe to Tricontinental Research for your excellent writing. And it's not just you. There's a team of researchers and analysts and journalists who are providing material. If you don't like the capitalist media, subscribe to Tricontinental Research, because you need information and you're not going to get it from the New York Times. But I want to read from the dossier, from your recent dossier. We're surging, this is quoting an American official, we're surging additional military assistance, which has amounted to a record level of $17.9 billion during the past year. Now, that's taken from the bourgeois media, from the capitalist media. $17.9 billion. I want people to think about this, because you also say that there have been 100 separate foreign military sales to Israel during the last year, and thousands of precision-guided munitions, small diameter bombs, bunker busters, small arms, and other lethal aid. $17.9 billion. Normally, the U.S. gives to Israel $3 to $5 billion a year. It's the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid and military aid. So in a way, people should think of Israel as an appendage or an extension of American military and economic power, because take that aid away. Take that $3 to $5 billion away each year. Take the $17.9 billion away from the past year. No, they couldn't be dropping bombs on 10 cities as they did in the last few days, Vijay, burning those people, including patients hooked up to IV machines. They couldn't have done that. In the United States, our movement, the anti-war movement, the solidarity movement, is continuing. It's very robust. On November 2nd, there's going to be demonstrations in cities all over the country saying, no vote for genocide. Like, don't vote for the Republicans or the Democrats. Don't vote for genocide. But also to make the point that no matter how much Biden and Harris say they want a ceasefire, no matter how much they whine about the fact that Israel is killing, quote, too many Palestinians, as if there's a right number that they have surpassed, too many civilians have been killed, Biden said, as if there's a better number of civilians who should have been killed. If the United States, if there is an arms embargo against Israel, which is what the demonstrations are now demanding in the U.S., and as you pointed out, in Germany and around the world, an arms embargo on Israel, that would mean this would stop. The arms to Israel are the key thing.
I mean, if you look at it, the United States is now, as we are speaking, saying that unless the Israelis within 30 days increase aid to Gaza, there will be a slowdown in military, delivery of military equipment. But this comes right after the US delivers its latest tranche of equipment. There was some moderate pressure on President Biden to sanction one particular heinous battalion of the Israeli military, refused to do it. I mean, it's look, I've looked at wars for a long time, like you, and it's an uncomfortable, ugly business. Soldiers do terrible things in the middle of war. There's something very strange about what we're witnessing in this war. On the one side, there is a U.S. government constantly saying, we are trying to pressure Israel, but then pressuring them by giving them more arms. The U.S. government saying Israeli soldiers need to behave better, but refusing to sanction any of the brigades for really terrible, heinous human rights violations. How do we know they are heinous? We know it because the soldiers have been filming it themselves and posting it on social media. Al Jazeera just ran a very good little film about basically using the soldiers' own social media posts to show these violations. In fact, naming some of the soldiers. Some of these soldiers, out of embarrassment, have removed the post. So perhaps their commanding officer said, get rid of it. But it's out there already. There's a movie made of it. So we know that there's been horrendous attacks, civil snipers just sort of playing a game, trying to shoot kids, pretending that it's a video game. It's not a video game. There's real children at the other end of their scope, and then just posting all that on social media. The vulgarity of it all is plain to see. And then to watch US governments officials try to wring their hands and say, well, we're trying to put pressure, is ridiculous. This is one of the oldest debates in foreign policy. Does the United States drive Israeli policy? Does Israel drive the US on Israel? I mean, what's the relationship between the tail and the dog? Who's the dog? Who's the tail between the US and Israel? I frankly think it's a meaningless exercise to try to adjudicate who's the head, who's the arm. It's a meaningless exercise. These two entities, the United States government, its elites, the Israeli government, its elites, the military establishment, they're entirely interpenetrated. I don't think this is a question of, the diabolical Mr. Netanyahu as an individual who's sort of playing the fiddle and the US government is dancing. I think there are intertwined interests here. We can't make this just about Netanyahu. This is about an elite establishment of Israelis and the United States, which have kind of come to some understanding that the Palestinian question has to be set aside, that Iran is the principal enemy, that the United States is willing to allow Mr. Netanyahu to, as much as possible, provoke Iran into a fight. It's very interesting. The bombing of Syed Hassan Nasrallah was a direct attack at Iran, not just at the Lebanese people, because the moment Nasrallah was killed, and the Israelis have enough intelligence to know this was going to happen. Nasrallah is one of the most beloved figures within Iran. Brian, it's unusual to see the black flag of mourning go up on Shiite shrines all around the world. There was a black flag on top of the Saida Zainab shrine outside Damascus. There were black flags in most of the important shrines in Qom and so on. This was a direct provocation against the Iranians. And the Iranians then do react in I think, a very interesting way. They attacked military sites and said, look, we are not going to even follow the retribution doctrine. You kill civilians, we'll kill civilians. We are going to continue merely to hit military targets. That was their statement, because they don't want to get dragged into a war. Seems that there's a large section of the Israeli establishment and the US establishment that believes that expanding this genocide in Gaza into Lebanon, perhaps into Syria and so on, is going to draw the Iranians in. And this is going to provide an opportunity to at least strike Tehran and try to put the Iranians on the back foot. These are really dangerous people, and they don't seem to care about questions like civilian deaths and so on. I don't like to even think that this is the case with people like that in the modern world, that they would be so callous about the use of weaponry. But their callousness is not only on display vis-a-vis Iran, which is a relatively small defensive power, but their callousness is on display vis-a-vis Russia. The Germans are expanding, building a military base in Lithuania. They don't seem to care that this is going to further provoke anxiety in Moscow. They will next probably put mid-range missiles into this German base in Lithuania, where they'll have 5,000 German troops there. The United States expanding the Tyndall Air Base in Darwin, Australia, expanding the runway so that they're going to have a whole fleet of B-52s sitting just 2,000 kilometers away from China. These are systems that can carry nuclear bombs. The United States has expanded already its bases in Philippines. Now they number 9 bases. The Guam base has been retrofitted recently. The largest base in Japan was recently redone, and so on. I mean, these are very, very dangerous people who don't seem to care about the consequences of this kind of military recklessness. In fact, they seem to revel in it. They believe that if they could be tough, that somehow China, Iran, Russia will all pack it in and decide, you know what, we're just going to be national powers, not even try to be regional powers or to have a global footprint. The Chinese are just going to say, let's wind up the Belt and Road Initiative, go back home and just rebuild China and so on. This is the fantasy. If they scare them enough, the sea and enemy will close. That's reckless policy making.
I'm going to stay with this reckless question because I think it's really important for our audience. But before I do, I do want to point out to people that there was a major article. It's an essay. It's an op-ed, actually, in the New York Times about a week ago from a group of doctors who were in Gaza. And the thing they write about that shocked them, these are not people who are pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah. They're doctors who came to Gaza because of the humanitarian crisis. And they were like, we kept finding all these kids, 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, with direct hits, bullet wounds to the head, meaning the children, the babies, had been sniped. They were the victims of snipers. And it was so disturbing to them. They actually talk in the article, the author talks in the article about how these doctors can't sleep. They're like so upset that this happened. And now the pro-Israeli forces in America are really attacking the hell out of these authors and against the story and against the New York Times for publishing fake news. So undoubtedly, the ferociousness of the counterattack for having, these are doctors who wrote about their experiences in Gaza, and they're now being viciously attacked because they told the truth that babies and toddlers are being victims of sniper fire. They wouldn't be making this up. Anyway, I want to go back to recklessness. I just wanted to comment since you had mentioned it. If people look at history, and again, sadly, most people in the United States know nothing about history, you'll become alarmed, especially at certain moments. Like if you go back to the period right before World War I, which was not that long ago, it was 110 years ago. None of the powers that, quote, started World War I, engaged in World War I, thought it would be World War I. None of them thought Austria, Germany/Prussia, the Ottomans, none of them thought, we're about the actions we're initiating right now in July and August 1914 are going to lead to a, quote, world war. Something like that hadn't happened before. And yet it did happen. It was warfare different from earlier wars because it was industrial style war. They now had airplanes that could drop bombs. They had, chemical weapons that could float across the plains into trenches. So you had 18 to 20 million people get killed in World War I, and the initiators of the war never expected it. They thought it was going to be another quick war, and it would be over right away. But before World War I, There was the Balkans Wars of 1912 and 1913. And those were the precursor events without which World War I would not have happened. When we look at the world today, Vijay, we see this recklessness, hubris, arrogance by big powers, and this sort of also the superficial sort of understanding of what's at stake, as if everybody can just be tough, meaning everybody, meaning the US and NATO, can just be tough enough, deploy enough weapons, threaten enough people, give the green light to like regional war for the Israelis against Iran or whatever, that everything will, break in their direction, when in fact we could be on the verge of a global catastrophe, because if pushed far enough, other powers like Russia, like China, like Iran, which is not a small country, it's not a massive country, but it's got 90 million people in it, and it's got a sophisticated and big military, push far enough, the different parties will take counter actions. And we climb the escalation ladder. That's easy. How does a politician or a general climb down when nobody wants to look weak? I mean, this is the dynamic of the current sort of state of imperialist politics. It's not China's politics. And even though the US wants to demonize Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, Russia did not want war with Ukraine. They wanted an agreement where Ukraine would be neutral and not part of NATO. The real belligerents here are the United States and NATO. And again, I think it's based on recklessness, as you said, hubris, arrogance, and thinking nothing bad will happen, nothing really bad will happen, when in fact everything bad could happen.
When you go into any kind of negotiation, I'm not even talking about a military. If you go into a negotiation, before you go into it, if you're an intelligent person, you'll try to play out what are the various scenarios. If this happens, where is it going to go? And you try to see what are the outcomes that are desirable for me. What is the outcome where there's least harm? What is the worst outcome? That's a normal person, before they go into any negotiation or discussion, tries to think what are the various outcomes. I've often tried to get into the head of a US establishment thinker and said, well, what's the outcome in pushing Russia against the wall? What's the outcome? What's the outcome of trying to box in Iran? What's the outcome of being threatening against China? What are the necessary outcomes that will help me understand what does the best for me, what is the least harm, and so on. If you look at the case of China, which I think is the most interesting, there is no good outcome of this maximum campaign against China. There is no good outcome, because the only thing that would produce a moderately good outcome for the United States is indeed if the Chinese government says that we are willing to deflate our currency, we are willing to stop expanding our industry, we are willing to in fact roll back our technological developments. We're no longer going to produce chips, we're no longer going to do all these things. You produce the designs, we'll provide the labor to produce the commodities. That's the only good outcome for the United States. But that outcome is impossible for the Chinese. It is impossible, because that outcome would be worse than the century of humiliation that started with the first Opium War and ended with the Chinese Revolution. It would be worse than that, because now, rather than just being a major world power, which people didn't know they were, the Chinese in the 1830s, the Chinese population, they didn't know that later Agnes Madison will study global income and come up with a theory that China was actually in a better shape than Europe. Most of them didn't even know the existence of Europe in the 1830s. But today, in the 21st century, the Chinese population knows that they have built really good trains, they have really good technology, and so on. To roll this back now would be worse in terms of humiliation than in the aftermath of the Opium War, the first Opium War. There is a large patriotic element in China, which would just not allow this to happen. There is no political space, in other words, for a Chinese surrender. So the only good outcome for the United States is impossible for China. So why would you attempt a politics which has an impossible outcome? That's the China scenario. If I was the United States, I'd collaborate with China, not confront China in this way. The Chinese don't want a confrontation, they want to collaborate. With Russia, what's the possible outcome? From the 1980s, the Soviet government had been saying, look, we don't want NATO expansion. This has been a stuck record, except for a few years in the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin and then Vladimir Putin both were interested, in fact, in bringing Russia into NATO. They actually wanted to apply to enter NATO. Brief period. But in the long history since the reunification of Germany, the Russians have warned against the expansion of NATO. Now, well, you continue to expand NATO and you're stuck in a position where the German military has to open a base in Lithuania. This is a direct confrontation to a broader war. It's not a good outcome. Why would you go there? Why not provide security guarantees, not only for the Russians? And I'm sympathetic to countries like Georgia and Ukraine and the Baltic states, but a security deal with Russia is also a security deal with the small countries that border Russia. Russia is a very big country in that part of the world. Even the small countries would benefit more from a security deal than from entering NATO, which is creating anxiety. So, Brian, if you're a relatively intelligent person and you try to think through the implications of some of these policies, none of the policies of the West, whether it's in Russia or in China, end well. And if we take the case of Iran, okay, United States has the capacity to flatten Iran. It has the capacity to do that. Iran will fire a lot of missiles and so on, but it could be really badly damaged if the United States went forward and dropped, I don't know, 10 times the amount of weapons that the Israelis have dropped on Gaza. They could really damage Tehran and so on, which the Iranians don't want. They don't want a frontal confrontation with the US. But what's the outcome? The outcome is the 89 million people that survive. If 1 million get killed, the 89 million people that survive are going to hate the United States for the next 3 centuries. Is that really what you want? You have the capacity as the United States flatten any country, but people will hate you for a very long time. I had this discussion once, Brian, with a person in the US military who said, well, but the Vietnamese don't hate us. And I said, well, that's because that they had a political experience that was different. Their revolution was led by people like Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, and so on, who provided them a different analysis of the world. They said, we're not fighting the United States, we're fighting imperialism. In Iran, it's a different situation. The Iranian people understand this to be a war not only against imperialism, but the United States. So there will be a residual feeling of hatred to the US. I don't think you want that. I think there is no comparison between Iran and Vietnam. They are different political places with different political projects. So I really don't get it, Brian. I mean, I would love to have a conversation with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and ask them sincerely, this agenda you're pursuing, where do you think it's going to end? I mean, I know you want the United States to be the best country in the world forever. It's just not going to be like that. Can't you come to terms with reality?
Excellent points. It just made me think, Vijay, when you were talking about the Russians actually applied to join NATO, both Boris Yeltsin and Putin. And Putin has talked about that recently in the last couple of years. So that wasn't the first time, by the way. Back when the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union, when it was led by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, NATO was formed in 1949. In 1955, Germany was divided. That was 10 years after the end of World War II, where 27 million Soviets had died. And the Soviets made an offer. Stalin had just died. Khrushchev was about to become the #1 head of state in the Soviet Union. But the Soviets in 1955 offered the United States this quid pro quo. They said, if you keep West Germany, and they viewed Germany as the reason they lost 27 million people, if you keep West Germany out of NATO, we will join NATO. We, the Soviet Union, the communist-led Soviet Union, will become part of NATO, which means part of a US-led military alliance. To which the United States said, no way, just as Blinken and Biden said no to Russia now, 70 years later. They said, no way. They brought West Germany, which was still filled with ex-Nazis in their leadership, into NATO. And then the Soviets turned around and said, okay, that's when the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. The NATO wasn't in response to the Soviet aggression. The Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance of East European socialist governments and the Soviet Union, when the U.S. said, no, we won't let you into NATO. We're going to instead pick former Nazi Germany to come into NATO. Now, you think about that. I've thought about this a lot, Vijay, and I'm going to ask you about it because at that time, that was explained on the basis that the U.S. was engaged in this global fight against communism. It was a battle between communism and capitalism, between democracy and totalitarianism. In other words, it had this very powerful ideological sort of overlay in terms of how it was presented. Now, Russia is not led by the Communist Party. China is led by a Communist Party, but China is definitely, and no one thinks they're pursuing an agenda of world revolution against other Western capitalist powers. They just want to actually have, as you said, peaceful coexistence. They call it win-win. Our rise doesn't hurt you. So there's no ideological element here, and yet the same hubris, the same arrogance, the same ridiculous refusal to find any other path other than war dominates, really literally dominates. So even though the fight against communism seems to, quote, be over, at least on a global scale, I mean, as a Marxist, I don't think it's over, but you know what I'm talking about. The struggle against Russia and China continues nonetheless. Why?
It's really interesting. You know, the history that you provided from 1955 is interesting, but underneath that era's enormous ideological language and the claims about ideology lay something also much more unifying about our two periods. Let's say the period of that Cold War and now. What was that? I was quite surprised reading US State Department documents to discover a document from the late 40s where one of the State Department planners quite boldly wrote, and by the way, they wrote much more elaborate English in those days than they write now. The documents are much better written. Partly, I think they were all graduates of Harvard and Yale and so on. They had readings of classics or whatever it was. But one of the documents I read, he said the goal of US foreign policy is to seek preponderant power. That phrase has always been with me. To seek preponderant power. I had to look up what the word preponderant meant or where it came from. It's actually a word from divinity. It's the power of gods. It's not the power of humans. Preponderant has all the meaning of divine power, the power of kings not over US territory, mind you, because he writes the foreign policy of the United States is about seeking preponderant power. In other texts from that period, they talk about the importance of primacy. That's the other word. Preponderant power, that phrase, and primacy. Strikes me that if you go from 1949 to the present, this is an underlying theme in the US elites, this belief that the United States must seek preponderant power, that no challengers can appear. And, over the years, you get weaker and weaker statements which basically say the same thing. You remember the Trump doctrine when it came out. His then defense secretary, quickly disgraced, made a statement saying we have to make sure that near peer rivals are squashed. The Trump doctrine was about putting China and Russia in their place. They can't stand up and claim to be equals to us. The Chinese cannot be our equal. They cannot contest Europe. They cannot contest Africa. The United States must seek preponderant power. And one of the elements which I think is quite unifying in parts of the Republican establishment is they feel that the Democratic Party doesn't seek preponderant power in a testosterone filled way, that they somehow seek preponderant power weakly. Nobody suggests that the Democratic Party is not seeking preponderant power, but these two parties, sort of attack each other, one for being too muscular and one for being not muscular enough. It's the attitude towards the policy, not a policy difference. Both of them seemed unified in the idea that US power must be primary, that US primacy is so important. But they just disagree maybe on the mood or the way in which you talk about things and so on. I mean, I've often been confounded when people, say things like, well, Bush was the worst president, and Obama was better. Well, but they both sought primacy in different ways, and in fact, not even such different ways. They just talked about them differently. There are enough photographs of Mr. Obama in a bomber jacket roaming around. You don't need to, sit around the web spending hours to find them. In fact, there is a kind of sartorial, arrogance of U.S. presidents that they display themselves not in. They don't wear private's uniform. They don't wear Navy uniforms. They wear the jackets of bombers. Because this is the way in which you demonstrate preponderant power. And by the way, you mentioned the newsletter that I had published. In it, I quote from Arthur Bomber Harris, squadron commander of the Royal Air Force. Um, Arthur Bomber Harris had a career bombing Iraq, bombing Afghanistan, and bombing what is now Pakistan, but then northern parts of British India. He was doing these bombing runs in the 1920s, and he became quite a distinguished theorist within the Royal Air Force of bombing. One of the key points that Arthur Bomber Harris makes in his many memoranda, many of them were actually withdrawn by the RAF because at the time they found it a bit embarrassing. But what Bomber Harris said is pretty interesting. By the way, imagine that his nickname was Bomber, Arthur Harris, but known as Arthur Bomber Harris. What he writes in a number of his memoranda is that aerial bombardment has two advantages. One, the savage who's on the ground doesn't have a way to bring the plane down. This is plainly dishonorable warfare because you're up there thousands of feet above, and their little pistols or bows and arrows can't get to your cockpit. So they can't touch you. They have no way of fighting an honorable battle. He makes that point. But the second point is actually the one that's significant and where preponderant power with its divinity plays a role. What Harris says is we need to bomb the savages so viciously that it is an example for everybody else. Every bombing run is pedagogical. It's to teach them not to mess with us because we can unleash the fire of gods, fire that they've never seen before. That's how the bombings are done even today. They are to unleash the fires of hell on people who have no way to get to the aircraft above, no way to hit the drones, no way to defend themselves. And they feel the fires of hell on earth. And that is pedagogical. It's meant to teach them to accept the preponderant power of the main imperialist power of the time. Bomber Harris was talking about the British in the 1920s, but 100 years later, we're talking about the United States and its allies. They want to continue to exercise divine wrath against people who have the nerve to stand up against them, but not even against them. Sometimes who have the nerve to just stand up for themselves. The Chinese are not even contesting the United States. They're just saying, we would like to produce good phones. And the US government is saying, you can't. You cannot stand up for yourself. If you do so, we will unleash divine wrath on you, the fires of hell, to establish our preponderant power. And that's why I feel the real ideology here isn't capitalism, communism, and so on. It is this belief that certain countries have, by divine right, the blessing to be the main powers in the world forever. That's a racist, imperialist idea that lingers around the ruling classes of many of these countries in the North Atlantic.
I couldn't agree with you more. Karl Marx made the point that capitalism came into existence with blood dripping from every pore. The capitalists of today, the imperialists of today, and capitalism has morphed into imperialism. Yeah, you're right. They have the same orientation. Everything belongs to them. That they will do anything. There's no crime that they will not commit in order to subjugate the people. And just a final note for our audience: when you think about Operation Rolling Thunder in Vietnam, the U.S. carpet bombed Vietnam for every week for 3 years. That's more than 150 weeks. And the Pentagon's estimate was they were killing 1,000 civilians per week. So that's more than 150,000 people. Those are the U.S. That's what the Pentagon says about itself. They did that, and yet they lost. They lost because the Vietnamese people won't stop fighting. It looks so terrible, and their idea, Vijay, of extreme power, the fire that people had never thought possible, those kind of shock and awe sort of terrorist actions against the masses, that they would subjugate the people. And it's so terrible what's happened, the death and the destruction. And yet there is this other element in contemporary politics, which is the fire that burns within each person, especially those who have suffered from colonialism, to be free people, to be self-determining, to resist occupation. The U.S., no matter how it exerts this primacy, ultimately, and they can succeed at killing so many, but they won't succeed in extinguishing the struggle. And I think it's really important for people to keep that in mind. And this is what makes the capitalism and imperialism, their thinking, their spirit, their thoughts, all of it sort of not only evil and ugly, but irrational. Because as you said, Vijay, if they had offered the people of the world an olive branch and said, let's cooperate and let's be equal, the thing they can't do, the people of the world would have grabbed hold of that olive branch. Anyway, I'm going to, in the next 30 seconds, give you the final word.
I mean, look, I very much agree that people around the world are not going to be suppressed. I think that's the exact point. Why does a military force accelerate its attacks? I mean, after a year, the Israelis are still bombing in northern Gaza because the Palestinians are not going away. They continue to resist. They continue to stand up. The protests around the world, despite the fact that some people may feel like, this is futile. Why do we keep coming week upon week? It is having a major impact. And here's a good example of the impact. The Nobel Prize Committee gave the Literature Prize to a very good South Korean novelist, Han Kang. And Han Kang, having received the prize, made a statement through her father where she said, I don't want a celebration for this prize. She's from South Korea, mind you. I don't want a celebration for this prize. As long as there is war, as long as there is suffering, we cannot celebrate literature. It's an amazing statement, a really powerful statement about the new mood that has come upon the world. People are not going to take this lightly, not going to take this lying down.
All right, Vijay, I want people to subscribe to your amazing dossiers. I mean, it's brilliant writing. It's the best in the world. It's the most important news source for people. It's regular. You have an amazing team. It's Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. If you could just say how people can find you on the internet.
Well, you have to go to a website called the Tricontinental. It's a big mouthful, but you'll find it. Look for it, you'll find it.
.org or .com?
It's .org. Sorry, the tricontinental.org. I'm 1,000 years old, Brian.
All right, Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for joining us.